thank you very much. I'm going to give a sort of Fidel Castro length talk, so I'm a bit concerned for those of you at the back. If you're willing to sit on the floor, there's a lot of room here if you want. There's tons of room, or you can stand. Yeah, so I'm very happy to be back in Sydney, and I'm happy to be back at SLA. We've had some adventures together, Robbie and Liz and Jeff and I, and happy to be also with my new Melbourne partners, Steve and Lee at the back there. So thank you. Thanks for your hospitality, and thanks for your invitation. As Liz said, I've spent the past 20 years working in a particular way on addressing complex social challenges, climate change in Canada and regional development in the US, judicial impunity in Argentina, child malnutrition in India, violent conflict in Colombia, sustainable food supply chains in Europe. And when I look back on that 20 years of work, one of the key patterns I've observed is that complex social challenges tend to get stuck. And this observation, on the one hand, has disturbed me, but on the other hand, has given me a lot of energy to try to understand what's going on here. And so what I've done, my colleagues and I, is spend the past 20 years attempting to address these stuck social challenges with much trial and much error and much learning. And that's what I want to talk to you about this evening. In particular, really two questions. The first is, why is it that complex social challenges get stuck? And secondly, how is it that we can work to get unstuck or to create forward movement? So the first, on why is it that we so often get stuck in trying to address complex social challenges. I spent the first 2 weeks of December in Copenhagen participating in the United Nations negotiations on climate change. And for somebody who's interested in addressing complex social challenges, this was like being right in the middle of the Olympics. It was really fun. I enjoyed it a lot. The city of Copenhagen was filled with people working in every different way on climate change. There were concerts and conferences, exhibits, films. It seemed to me that on every street corner there were people protesting in one way or another, and on literally every billboard in Copenhagen there was a message about climate change. There were 50,000 people who participated in the civil society meeting, the Klima Forum, and then the middle of the first week of December there were 100,000 people who marched through the steps of Copenhagen, the streets of Copenhagen, while hundreds of thousands of others were marching through hundreds of other cities around the world. I'm sure in Sydney as well. I spent every minute I could in the Bella Center, which was the venue for the official UN negotiations, which was filled literally to capacity with 20,000 negotiators from 192 countries, and also NGO representatives and business representatives and scientists and media people. Everybody networked with each other and with their constituents and friends around the world. Every day in the Bella Center there were hundreds of negotiating sessions and formal and informal side meetings. I'd never seen a gathering like this. I'd never even heard of one, this scale and sophistication and seriousness. A friend of mine said it was like being in a class where everybody was really interested in the material and everybody had done all the pre-reading. The core dynamic that I observed in the Bella Center was a clash between two camps, each with its own drive and its own discourse. I'm not talking here about the collision between people who wanted action on climate change and people who didn't want action, or between rich countries and poor countries, although those were certainly present as well. I'm talking about a clash that, in my mind, was more fundamental. On one side, you had what I call the power camp. You had the governments of the US and Australia and other industrialized countries whose discourse was all about how could they maintain their competitiveness, their position in the world. You had the governments of China and my adopted country of South Africa and Brazil and other industrializing countries worried about their growth and also their sovereignty. You had African countries and other poor and vulnerable countries worried about their development and in some cases their very survival. And then you had mixed in oil companies and windmill companies and shipping companies concerned about their commercial prospects and their profits. The reason I group all of these parties together is that what they had in common, what the discourse of the power camp had in common, was that it was all about each party's need for development and growth and self-determination. Now on the other side, you had what I call the love camp. And the love camp was perfectly exemplified in the opening ceremony. The Monday of the first week in December, the Danish Minister of Climate, who was the chair of the conference, opened by emphasizing the responsibility that the delegates had over the 2 weeks that were to follow. Then Rajendra Pachauri, the head of the scientific body, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, gave a talk about the latest science and global balances and imbalances. There was a film that had been made for the conference which was about children and children in the future and the ethics of leaving a planet devastated by the unchecked effects of climate change. And then finally you had a choir, a Danish adult choir that sang beautifully. And there was a moment in the hall, I was sitting way at the back, where everybody's heart seemed to be joined. So the discourse of this love camp, with all its different facets, was all about interconnectedness and health of the planet and humanity as a whole. As you can imagine, these two distinct drives and discourses produced complexity, consternation, and conflict. And what was going on is that the two camps were radically polarized. The power camp's view of the love camp was that the love camp was being impractical, even unrealistic. And the love camp view of the power camp was that the power camp was being irresponsible, even oppressive. And yet, by the end of the second week in December, and now, my view is that both camps were strong and are strong, and neither of them is going to go away. And the reason is that the power camp can ignore or deny the importance of interconnectedness and health of the planet as a whole, but ignoring it or denying it doesn't make it go away. I spent quite a lot of time in Copenhagen with a friend of mine who's a climate scientist, and he kept muttering under his breath, "You can't negotiate with Mother Earth." So you can pretend or deny the interconnectedness, but that doesn't make it go away. And similarly, the love camp can ignore or deny development and growth and sovereignty, but that doesn't make it go away. Sitting in the back of the negotiating room over the course of the 2 weeks, several of the most telling and touching moments were when a man named Ian Fry, I think he's an Australian, but who was there as the representative of the Pacific island of Tuvalu, raised his hand to speak. Tuvalu is a small country, 12,000 people. The highest point on the island is 4.5 meters above sea level. And several times, right from literally the very first session to the very last session, Ian Fry would raise his hand and he'd say, I'm sorry to be difficult here, but I just cannot, we, the government of Tuvalu, can just not go along with what's happening here. If we continue on the path that we're moving on, my country will cease to exist. So what I was left with is that this collision in Copenhagen between the power camp and the love camp was a collision